Can you hear me? All good. All right, the 21st century is the best era in American history. In order to determine this, we need a standard. The standard I propose is that of quality of life. Any way of judging would be by which era has the highest quality of life. I have three contentions. The first is that of technology. In this century, we have a higher technology than we have ever had before. For instance, things that we have now that we have not previously had. Air conditioning, huge advantage that most people take for granted, but it changes everything. We have much better medicine. We have much better life expectancy. We have much better transportation, such as cars and a transit system. This is significantly better we've ever had. Two, economy. Over the last 20 years, nearly 1 billion people have been taken out of extreme poverty. Over the last 50 years, nearly half of the world has been raised out of extreme poverty. This is higher than we have ever had in history. This is the greatest era in American history and even in the world history. Three, civil rights. In today's world, we have so much better protection for the civil rights of human beings than we have at any point. Now, it's not perfect. There's still things that need to be updated. But at this point, history has moved us forward more than ever before.
Okay. I have one main argument here. My opponent says that we should be measuring this by quality of life. My response is the alternate standard of importance. Now, I agree with all of his contentions. The 21st century by far is the best quality of life of any other century. That's unarguable. But instead, that doesn't make it the best era in American history. We should be measuring best by which is most vital to American history. So I've got two reasons to prefer this value. The first is foundational. Importance is foundational. We couldn't have American history, or essentially whatever is most important. We have to look at what's most foundational is what I'm arguing here. The second is necessity. We need to be looking at what's most necessary. So when we're looking at importance, we're looking at what's foundational, what's necessary. I have one argument here, which is the 18th century was more foundational and more necessary. Without the 18th century, there'd be no United States of America, and the world would not look at the way it would. There would be no American history if there wasn't the 18th century starting the United States of America in the first place. That makes it more important, more foundational, more necessary.
All right, so overall, he has a squirrely interpretation on the resolution. My response is that of common man. If you ask the common man, what does this resolution mean? None of them would tell you that, oh, it means what is the most foundational? When was the country started? Nobody would look at this resolution. The 21st century is the best era in American history and think, oh, is that the era in which America was founded? Nobody would ask that. That's simply a squirrely interpretation of the resolution, which isn't even accurate. So his only reason to prefer is that because when America first started, that was important to America, but that's completely different than what the resolution is actually asking. It's asking us for the best era in American history. It's not asking for what was the first era in American history. He has a squirrely interpretation of the resolution. You should vote against him already.
So my opponent's main argument here is that he thinks other people don't like my interpretation. So let's first look at the warrants behind it. Let's say, for example, I say Coca-Cola is the best soda. That's not necessarily because it's the best tasting soda, but rather it was one of the first sodas that now everything else launches out from it. In the same way, you can talk about almost anything like that. You can say, for example, you could say, you know, The Exorcist is the best horror movie. There are other far scarier horror movies, but The Exorcist, as one of the original first mainstream huge horror movies, shows to be the best because those others couldn't exist without it. So take everything he likes about the 21st century, none of it would exist if we hadn't had the 18th century when America was founded. He doesn't contest this point, which means it's the best century because the only way we get any of the good things he's talking about is if this one exists. So he says common man. My response is logic. If we look at the logic of this, we see why the 18th century is the best.
If you asked me what the best soda was and I said Coca-Cola, it would be because it's the one that tastes the best, not because it came before Pepsi. We judge this off of merit. Which one has the most merit? When we ask the question, what's the best era in American history, we judge it off of merit, which he already agreed is the 21st century. I've already won this round. Let's look at his example of The Exorcist. He said The Exorcist is the best because it was the first. No, it wasn't. The Exorcist wasn't the first horror movie. There have been horror movies for years. The Exorcist was the best because it had the most merit. It's an incredibly well-made movie, which revolutionized many elements of the film industry. So it's because of its merits that you measure something. Let's look at the merits of the 21st century versus any other century. We already talked about these. But for instance, the technology that we have now is so much better than we've ever had in history. The economy has brought so many people forward. Civil rights are so much better than they've ever been in history. Sure, it's not perfect, but it's better than we've ever had before. This is the best era in American history.
opponent talks really loudly about how we measure best by essentially its merit. If you look up the word merit, what it means essentially is something's important qualities. You say, this person has a lot of merit. That means they have these necessary qualities. They have what's necessary in other for something else. If I'm interviewing somebody, I say, this employee has a lot of merit. That means he has what's necessary to succeed. Look at what's necessary for American history to even exist, would be the 18th century. That's the argument here. He talks about how Pepsi or Coca-Cola and The Exorcist, yeah, you could make those arguments for them. I'm not saying you couldn't. I'm just also saying you could make the argument saying Coca-Cola is the best soda because it pioneered this new age of soda. The Exorcist was the best movie because it pioneered this new age of horror movie. Was it the first horror movie? No, but it pioneered a new era of horror. Same thing with Coca-Cola. First soda? No, pioneered a new era. 18th century, first country? No, but it pioneered the new era of the United States of American history.
As an example of an employee, if you ask an employee what would be necessary to succeed, my response would be older. Essentially what he's saying is if they're older, if they started first, if they pioneered a new thing, they're better. But you wouldn't judge an employee's merit off of if they're older. You judge an employee's merit off of if they have more talent. It's the same here. When you judge what the 21st century, when you judge if it's the best era in American history, you have to compare it to the other centuries and say which one has the most merit. And the answer is the 21st century. Clearly, he already agreed with that. And then you talk about how certain things have prioritized and revolutionized, sure. But you don't say that something is best just because it was the first. You say it's best because it has the most standards, because it has the most levels. It has the most level of merit that you can add. For instance, we don't say the best era in Roman history was the day it was founded. We say it was when it was at its peak around the world. Same here. American history is best when we are at our best.
So I have one key issue here this really comes down to. No 21st century without 18th century. When we're looking at what's best, we have to be looking at what's most important, foundational, and necessary. My opponent says, oh no, what we're looking at essentially is what has the most of whatever, the most levels, the highest quality or something. That's not what we're looking at when we're talking about this. Why? Because all of those levels, everything that exists, couldn't exist without the 18th century. He talks about a mountain when you were at the peak. Guess what? If that mountain didn't have a base, it wouldn't be there. There'd be no peak to reach at all. Essentially what we're saying here is what it comes down to is this. There's no way we have any levels at all, any of these qualities my opponent desires in centuries without the 18th century. That in and of itself makes it the best. It's the most important, the most foundational, and the most necessary.
A first foundation does not make something best. Just because you were founded on something good doesn't mean you wind up being good. I work with nonprofits. A lot of nonprofits are founded off of the guy's overall merit. Like he might be a capitalist. He might love capitalism. And then after time goes on, after his death, the foundation changes and starts giving to liberal causes. This happens all the time. Just because you have a good foundation doesn't mean you're the best. In order to measure the best, you look at the right now. And especially since it's even right there on the resolution, the 21st century. If you're measuring it, you measure that off of what is right now, and you compare that to other things. Just because America had a good foundation doesn't mean that was the best era in American history. In fact, you can even look to all the flaws that were there back at that time. The women did not have the right to vote. There were violations of civil rights of Black people. There was much less economic benefit. It doesn't matter if there was a good foundation if the best era is now.
So let's take a look at all these things my opponent likes. None of them would exist without the 18th century. He says this is the best era because it has the highest quality of life that exists anywhere else. But let's remember, he talks about civil rights. No civil rights movements could have been made forth if it wasn't for the first revolution we had in America. He talks about the economy. The economy couldn't have gotten to where it is today if it wasn't for what happened in the American Revolution. We measure what's best not by this interpretation of, oh, where's the highest quality here, but what could we not exist without? That's the highest standard in today's debate round is what could we not exist without, essentially. If you're saying, well, I really think water's the best drink, it's because you can't exist without it. In the same way, that's why we're talking about what's most important, foundational, and necessary. Nothing he's arguing for could exist without the 18th century.
Nothing that I'm arguing for could exist without the first century, or the second century, or the third century, or the fourth century. It doesn't matter. The question is which one is best. And you weigh that by determining the advantages of one century versus another. Otherwise, there's no debate. Otherwise, it's just first, which doesn't make sense.
Yeah, my opponent says, oh, it doesn't make sense, or there's no debate. If we were measuring by his standard, there'd be no debate. This is a standards debate, and that's what we're arguing about. And so when we look at this, he says, oh, it'd be the first century, the other century. I almost picked those centuries, but it says American history, so I did this 18th century instead. I totally agree to that. It's what's most important, foundational, necessary. It's the highest standard we can value.